My name is Robin Lee. Welcome to Buzz on the Bluffs, Vicksburg, Mississippi's Community Insight Program. We'll be taking a look at people, places, and events that impact our community. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for joining us today on Buzz on the Bluffs, and welcome back, Judge Chaney.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, we've talked about jury service, so today we're going to talk about the Criminal Justice Reform Act.
Okay.
Did I get that right?
You did.
Which is House Bill 585. I bet you didn't think I knew that, did you?
You're doing well.
You told me that. The problem is remembering it at my age.
That's all right.
Okay, so tell us what this is, and I don't even know enough to ask you any questions, so you're just going to have to go.
Well, I'll get started, and then you'll have some questions.
All right.
It's referred to the shorthand as House Bill 585, but it's actually a massive set of legislation that addresses all sorts of different things. It just went into effect July of this year, and so I thought it might be of some interest to tell you what some of the changes were, and then what was the impetus for messing with any of that stuff to begin with. When you look back at the history of that bill, it passed the Mississippi House with a vote of 105 to 13.
Wow.
It passed the Senate unanimously. And then when you look at who was pushing the bill, on the left you had the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center. You had the Mississippi Catholic Diocese supporting it. On the right, you had the National Rifle Association officers, the American Conservative Union, and the American Taxpayers Union.
All supporting it from their own perspective.
All from their own perspective, which explains then why all of a sudden you have a unanimous vote in the Mississippi Senate to pass it. And so that should pique your interest to say, how did all these people get together on anything? And so when you look at the problem, and I'm going to need to refer to my notes.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm talking about some numbers here. But the problem was that since 1983, the Mississippi prison population had quadrupled. In 2012, Mississippi had the second highest incarceration rate in the country.
Wait a minute. So in 20 years, our prison population doubled?
30 years.
30 years,
Quadrupled.
Okay.
Quadrupled. Quadrupled in 30 years.
Wow.
In 2012, we had the second highest incarceration rate. Number one was Louisiana. The cost in 2013 just for the Mississippi Department of Corrections was $360 million, which was about a 350% increase since that 1983 time period where we started.
Goodness gracious.
And so over the years, the legislature had come up with a series of patchwork bills to try to slow the prison growth, to try to slow the prison population. And the problem with that had been there were all sorts of early release, good time, all sorts of programs, and it made it completely impossible for judges, prosecutors, law enforcement to know when somebody received a sentence, how long were they going to serve. At judicial conferences, the last 3 years, the judges are concerned about that. I've got a judge friend from Macomb, Judge David Strong. He relates a story that he had sentenced a guy to, I think it was 7 years. And 2 or 3 months later, after church on Sunday, he was eating lunch with his family, and there across the table was the guy he had just sentenced to 7 years. He got his phone out to call the sheriff. He thought maybe he'd escaped or something, And what had happened?
He was out after a few months?
He was out after a few months, and he'd been placed on house arrest, quote unquote. But this judge was just livid. And so we would have officers from the judges now. I'm just talking about from the judge's perspective. We would have people from MDOC try to explain to us for a certain person, for a certain crime, if they got a certain sentence, how long will they serve? And that came with a book that was as big as the New York City phone directory. And it was literally impossible to get a straight answer. And so part of the problem then became that judges were increasing the sentences because they didn't have a good idea about how long these people were going to get out. And so that was some of the problem. And then just the growth in the prison population was part of the problem. And so Governor Bryant authorized a study committee The legislature agreed to it. There were 21 people who were on that initial committee, and from Vicksburg, Bill Lauderdale was on there, and our district attorney Ricky Smith. And so we had more representation perhaps than other counties, but it was a massive undertaking. I had attended some of the study meetings and study groups that they had. The Pew Charitable Trust gave some technical assistance and did some research for the committee. And so after they had studied it, they came up with some other facts that kind of accentuated the problems, and some of those were that the nonviolent offenders made up 2/3 of the increase in the prison population over the last 20 years. They found out that in 2012, 3/4 of the new offenders were in prison for nonviolent offenses. They realized
Such as what?
Shoplifting,
Okay.
grand larceny, those sorts of things. And then almost half of the total prison population was for nonviolent offenses. Then what they found out that what I had not realized was that more inmates were sent to prison over the last 5 years for parole and probation revocations as opposed to committing new crimes. And they found out that actually 75% of the parole and probation revocations were not new crimes. Sometimes 25% were, but 75% were not. They had in some way violated the terms of their supervision. And then the study concluded the judges had few sentencing alternatives. For most things, it was either prison or nothing. And so Representative Andy Gibson, who is chairman of the House Judiciary B Committee, he lamented that the state of Mississippi is paying more and more to imprison nonviolent offenders for longer and longer periods of time, and at the same time seeing more and more of them come right back into the prison system within 2 years. And so that was the problem, or those were the problems that they were trying to address. And so what I think are probably the highlights of the bill is that first of all, there's a certainty in sentencing. Okay? And so now for nonviolent offenders, regardless of their behavior in prison, and there needs to be some rewards, and I understand that. The MDOC would not be able to run the prison. But for nonviolent offenders, they have to serve at least 25% of the sentence. They could serve the whole thing depending on how they act, how they behave, and that sort of thing. For violent offenders, they now have to serve at least 50%. So now, a judge, a prosecutor, a sheriff, we have that information. It's real simple, and it should be simple, so people know what they're getting into. Now the early release for house arrest, which was the horror story that had happened to Judge Strong, MDOC is not allowed to do that. Judges are given more authority for house arrest, but MDOC on its own, that authority has been taken back. And then the bill came up with a uniform definition of which crimes were considered violent offenses and which ones were not. And then the law requires that for people who are put on parole or probation, post-release conviction or post-release sentencing or supervision, there need to be case plans developed for those people. And part of the idea is that for these technical violations, that could be you missed showing up for your probation officer's monthly report, or you tested hot for marijuana, or you didn't pay a supervision fee or fine. Those are all important things, but are they so important that they need to get sent back into the general population? And so what has been devised or authorized by this bill is to allow what they're going to call technical violation centers. And so for those sorts of things, there'll be a graduated scale. And so if somebody, first offense might be 30 days in a technical violation center. A second offense might be 60 days. If they've done 2 or 3 things, they might be 90 days. And it won't be in the regular prison population. It'll be somewhere else. if it's problem with employment and getting a job, they may receive some true rehabilitation services as far as, how do you act, how do you dress up to go to an interview, the importance of being there on time, and the importance of having a job so that if no other reason, you can pay on your fines, you can pay on your supervision fees and get back. So there'll be, again, before this law went into effect, the judges had the choice of, one, they might be in jail for 2 or 3 months. They have the hearing. Sure enough, there's no contest about the violation of the technical provisions, and so the judges were having to send them back to the prison population, which is why these numbers got so skewed. People were back in prison. They were nonviolent offenders. They had not committed new crimes. They had just failed to take care of their supervision. So I think that's an important aspect of it. And the idea is that it's going to save, or should save, the state of Mississippi a whole lot of money. And you're going to focus your prison budget, you're going to focus your prison beds on these violent offenders, which everybody agrees, or most everybody agrees, they need to be locked up. And so I think that sort of explains maybe why you had the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center. They probably were big proponents of the fact not imprisoning people for nonviolent offenders, not imprisoning for so long, and not imprisoning for such things as technical violations. On the right, I suspect that you had the National Rifle Association, the American Conservative Union, liking the fact that there will be certainty in sentencing, liking the fact that the budget wouldn't be spent, and it's just uncontrollable of how it had been. And then the judges like it from knowing that there's certainty in sentencing and knowing that they're going to have a little bit more discretion, perhaps, in coming up with some prison alternatives. Now, the bill's not perfect. There are going to be some things that have to be tweaked, and in fact, the bill itself envisions that there's going to be an oversight committee, and they're going to look at it and see, is it working? There were only, I think there was one stat that showed there was 60% of the prison population was in some sort of post-release supervision status, but only 6% of the budget. Well, that's skewed, and so they're going to have to come up with these training programs. They're going to have to come up with these technical violation centers. I'm not sure if they're going to have enough information in for this legislative session or not, but it's envisioned that it's going to be tweaked. There are going to be some changes made. And I think the judges, the prosecutors are going to have to understand, if we keep putting more and more people in prison for nonviolent offenders, the purpose of this act is not going to be remedied.
It's costing us more and more and more money.
Right. And so we do need to figure out what is the most important thing. And so from what I understand about the bill, and as it's slowly beginning it's in effect, but as it's being enacted, as we're seeing the effects of it, I think it's mostly going to be good. And if the parts that aren't working right, they can and should be tweaked. But it's just the certainty in sentencing was the thing that, at least from my, and other stakeholders had other things they were concerned about. The legislators were concerned about the budget, not being able to control it.
Sure.
MDOC was concerned about overcrowding in the prisons, and they've got court orders and restrictions on what they can do. So that's why you had such a different group of support, or support coming from such diverse groups. But it's a new bill, a new series of bills, I think, and it's going to be real interesting to see how it works. It changes things, but for the most part, those changes are going to be good.
Well, thank you for coming today, and
glad to be here.
Look forward to having you back again.